Hey, my name is Wesley Hart. I'm 33 years old, and I spend most of my life reinforcing buildings that are one bad storm away from collapsing, which people tell me is a strange career for a man who once left his own hometown without saying a single true thing he meant to say. 3 days ago, I drove back into Millbrook Falls for a 15-year reunion I had told everyone, myself included, that I wasn't attending. I was standing in the same gym where I used to run suicide drills for a coach who's probably retired by now, holding a paper cup of punch I had no plans of drinking, when the door at the far end swung open and June Marsh walked back into my life with a little girl's hand wrapped tight around hers. The room did that thing rooms do when everyone recognizes someone at once and nobody wants to be the first to react out loud. Conversations kept moving. Eyes didn't. Somebody near the drinks table murmured a sentence with the words Daniel and terrible in it, pitched low enough that I wasn't supposed to catch the rest, and I didn't. Not yet, not the whole story. June didn't look at any of them. She scanned the gym the way you check exits in a room you've already decided isn't safe, and then her eyes found mine and stopped moving. 3 seconds. Maybe 4, long enough that I noticed my own pulse. Somebody had strung up the same faded crepe paper we'd had at prom, and a playlist of songs from our senior year was looping through a speaker somebody had propped on the free throw line, and none of it registered as anything but background noise. My whole focus had narrowed down to 20 feet of gym floor, and the woman standing at the end of it, like the 15 years between us had just gone quiet, not disappeared. Then the little girl let go of her hand and started walking. She couldn't have been more than 6, in rubber boots that looked like they'd seen actual mud that day, not just decoration. She crossed that gym floor like she'd rehearsed the route, past a table of name tags nobody had bothered to alphabetize, past 2 of my old teammates who went quiet mid-sentence to watch her go, and she stopped about 2 feet in front of me, with her chin tipped all the way back, so she could see my whole face. She had a gap where a front tooth used to be, and the kind of total seriousness little kids get when they think they're doing something important. I crouched down without deciding to. She looked at me for a second like she was checking my face against a picture she already had memorized, and then she said it. "Mommy said you'd come." "Come where?" I finally managed to ask, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. "Here," like the answer should have been obvious. "To the dance. Mommy said the boy from her story might be here tonight, and I found you, so I win." She said this last part with the flat satisfaction of someone who considered the matter closed. I didn't have an answer for that either. I'm not sure I had anything in me yet that qualified as an answer. Behind her, June had gone the color of the cup in my hand, and she crossed the distance between us in about 4 fast steps, already apologizing before she'd fully arrived. "I'm so sorry." She talks to everyone. She doesn't, and then she stopped herself and just reached for the girl's hand instead of finishing the sentence. "Ren, honey, we talked about this." Ren didn't argue. She let herself be turned toward the door, but she looked back at me once over her shoulder, quick, like she was confirming something she'd already decided was true, and then the 2 of them were gone through the far doors, and the gym noise rushed back in to fill the space where they'd been standing. June didn't look back once. I stood there holding a cup of warm punch, trying to work out what had just happened to me, and coming up short. Teddy Okafor found me about 90 seconds later, the way Teddy always finds you, right when you'd rather be alone with your own thoughts for a while longer. He'd gone soft around the middle and gray at the temples since the last time I'd seen him, but he still had the exact laugh that used to get both of us sent to the office. He followed where I was still staring, toward the doors, and let out a low whistle. "You didn't hear," he said. "Didn't hear what?" Daniel Marsh, man. He died about 1.5 years ago. Ice storm out past the Orchard Road. Car went into the ditch on a curve everybody in this town has slid on at least once, and that was it. Something dropped through my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. I hadn't heard any of it. I'd spent most of that year on a job outside Tulsa, sleeping in a construction trailer, checking my phone maybe once a week if the site had signal at all. Teddy kept talking, filling in pieces I only half caught, but one detail landed and stayed put. "Wren's his kid," he said. "Theirs. She's 6 now, I think." Sweet as anything, whole towns watched June try to hold that orchard together on her own since it happened. And from what I hear, it hasn't exactly been easy. I didn't tell Teddy that 15 years ago, the night before I left for basic training, June Calder and I sat on the tailgate of my truck behind this exact building, and I had every intention of telling her I loved her. I'd built the sentence in my head that whole week, practiced it in the shower that morning like an idiot, out loud, quiet enough that my mother wouldn't hear through the wall. And when the actual moment arrived, when she looked over at me with the gym's porch light behind her and asked what I was thinking so hard about, I said, "I'll call you instead," which is what a coward says when the real sentence is too heavy to lift. I didn't call, not that week, not that month. By the time I found the nerve, enough silence had already gone by that a phone call felt like it would need an apology stitched to the front of it that I didn't know how to write, so I let it go quiet instead and told myself that was the kinder option for both of us. It wasn't. I understood that fully for the first time standing in a gymnasium 15 years later, watching a 6-year-old with her mother's exact chin tell a room full of strangers that her mother had been talking about me. I set my cup down on the nearest folding table and went after her. Teddy said something behind me I didn't catch and didn't turn around for. I found June in the parking lot, keys already out, wrestling a car seat buckle with the specific fury of someone who needs her hands busy so the rest of her doesn't have to be. Wren was already half asleep against the window, worn out from being the most honest person in the building. "June," I said. She didn't turn right away. When she finally did, she had her apology face back on, the same one from the gym, and I realized I'd probably seen that exact expression on her before, a long time ago, right around when I'd broken her heart in the gentlest, most cowardly way a person can manage it. "I'm sorry about Wren. She's been asking about you for years, and I genuinely never thought you'd walk through that door, so I never prepped her for what to do if you actually did." I told her it was fine. I meant it. She studied me for a second like she was deciding whether to believe that, and something in her shoulders came down half an inch. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "About me?" She looked past me at the gym doors, lit up gold against the dark lot, and let out a breath with a laugh caught somewhere inside it that didn't quite make it all the way out. "There's a story I used to tell her, about a boy who climbed the water tower on a dare and got his name on the town website for 3 days because nobody could figure out how he'd gotten down without a ladder. I told her he was somebody I used to know. I left out the part where he left town 2 weeks later and never called. Kids don't need the second half of stories. I remembered that water tower. I remembered exactly how much trouble I'd been in for it, and how June had been the only person who thought it was funny instead of reckless. I asked if I could walk her the rest of the way to her car, mostly because I wasn't ready for the conversation to end yet. "Okay," she managed, in a voice that told me she wasn't ready either, even if she'd never have admitted it out loud. We made it about halfway across the lot when headlights swung in fast off the main road, too fast for 10 at night in an empty parking lot, and stopped at an angle that boxed June's car in against the curb. A woman got out before the engine had finished ticking down. I didn't know her yet, but I knew the type on sight, the kind of person who walks like she's already won an argument she hasn't started. "We need to talk about Friday." The woman didn't so much as glance at me. June's whole posture shifted, straight and careful, the way you brace for a wave you've already been hit by once before. "It's 10 o'clock, Constance," she said. "My lawyer sent your lawyer everything this afternoon. There's nothing left to discuss tonight." Constance Marsh looked at June the way you'd look at a stain you were deciding whether was worth the effort of scrubbing out. And then, finally, her eyes moved to me. "And who is this?" A friend of June's, I said, before June could answer for me, mostly because I didn't care for how the question had been asked. Constance's eyebrows rose a fraction, filing that information away for later, and I had the distinct sense I'd just become a data point in a case I didn't understand yet. Friday, 10 a.m., Courthouse Annex. Still addressing June, not me. Bring the financials this time, all of them, not the version your lawyers decided looks good. Then she was back in her car and gone, taillights cutting hard around the corner, and June stood there with her keys biting into her palm from how tight she was gripping them. I didn't ask, I just waited, because some things you learn not to push on right away. After a minute, she leaned back against her car and told me anyway, in the flat, over-rehearsed voice of somebody who's explained this too many times to too many people who didn't actually help. Daniel's father set up a family trust 30 years ago that owns the orchard land outright. The house and the cider business are mine, clean, no argument there. But the land underneath all of it belongs to the trust, and Constance is the surviving co-trustee, which means every major decision about that property needs her signature. Since Daniel died, she's decided I can't run the place without him, and she's petitioning the court for partial guardianship of Wren on the grounds that I'm, quote, financially unstable and maintaining an unsafe environment, and if that goes through, the trust reverts to her sole discretion, and I don't have to draw you a picture of what happens to the orchard after that. I asked what unsafe environment meant, specifically. The cider barn. Structural concerns, she said, doing air quotes with fingers that were shaking slightly. Constance says it's a hazard for a 6-year-old to be anywhere near. I've had 3 separate contractors out there. Nobody's found a thing. Something in the back of my head, the part of me that gets paid to notice when a building is lying about how sound it actually is, filed that detail away and didn't let go of it. I ended up driving them both home, since June's hands were still shaking too much for her to want to trust them with a car full of sleeping kid, and I followed her directions out past the edge of town to a gravel road lined with trees, just starting to go heavy with unripe fruit. She carried Wren inside without waking her, moving like someone who'd done it 1,000 times, careful and completely unglamorous about it, and when she came back out to walk me to my truck, she stood there a second, with her arms crossed against the night air, like she was deciding whether to say something else. "Thank you for staying tonight," she said finally, "for not being weird about the whole gymnasium thing." I told her I was planning on being at least a little weird about the whole gymnasium thing eventually, just not necessarily tonight, and that got the first real laugh out of her I'd heard since she'd walked back into my life a few hours earlier. It was a good sound. I'd forgotten how much I used to like causing it. I told my mother I was staying in town an extra week to spend time with her, which was true, technically, the way a lot of things I say are true technically. What was also true was that by Wednesday morning I had directions to Marsh Orchard programmed into my truck before I'd fully admitted to myself I was going to use them. Tuesday was quieter on the surface. June called that evening, ostensibly to apologize again for Wren, and I told her there was nothing left to apologize for, and neither of us hung up. We ended up talking for 40 minutes about nothing that mattered, in the specific way you can only manage with someone whose voice already knows the shape of your silences. She told me the orchard had 140 trees, and that she still couldn't tell a Honeycrisp branch from a Gala one without checking the tags Daniel used to paint on them by hand. I told her about a bridge inspection I'd done outside Reno, where the whole structure had been sound except for one bolt. One that some contractor had swapped out for the wrong grade a decade earlier, and how something that small could sit there quietly failing for years before anyone noticed. She went quiet on the line for a second, and then said that sounded familiar somehow, and I didn't ask her to explain what she meant, because I had a feeling I already knew. Near the end of the call she asked, carefully, like she was testing the weight of the question before fully committing to it, whether I was planning on sticking around town much longer. I told her I hadn't decided yet. That was true then. It got less true every day after. June didn't seem surprised when I actually showed up Wednesday. She handed me a coffee mug without asking if I wanted one and told me Wren was around back feeding a chicken named Detective, a sentence I did not request an explanation for. Wren found me before I found her. She was crouched by the coop in boots 2 sizes too big, and she looked up when my shadow crossed her and gave me the same courtroom seriousness from the gym. "You came back." It sounded like she was double-checking the results of an experiment she'd run. I told her I did. She considered that for a second, then asked if I wanted to help her name the new chicken. And for the next 20 minutes, I stood in a coop debating the relative merits of nugget versus waffles with a 6-year-old, which was, without exaggeration, the most honest conversation I'd had with anyone in about a decade. At some point, out of nowhere, she asked if I'd loved her mom before her dad did. I didn't lie, and I didn't over-explain either. I told her yes, a long time ago, before either of us knew what to do with it. She nodded like the answer satisfied some internal ledger she'd been keeping, and went back to negotiating chicken names like nothing had happened at all. June found us there a few minutes later and, apparently satisfied that Waffles had been properly christened, walked me the rest of the way around the property herself, pointing out which rows Daniel had planted the year Wren was born, which ones his grandfather had put in decades before that. She talked about him easily, without the careful flatness people use when they're protecting themselves, telling me he used to hum off-key while pruning and swore the trees grew better for it, and that he'd once spent an entire weekend building Wren a treehouse he refused to let anyone help with, out of what June called pure stubborn pride, and what I recognized as something closer to love with its sleeves rolled up. I liked him from what she told me. That surprised me a little, how easy it was to like a dead man who'd married the woman I never called. She caught me looking at the treehouse a beat too long. "He'd have liked you, probably. Quiet enough that I almost missed it." Then, before I could figure out what to do with that sentence, she headed off toward the tasting room to open up for the afternoon, and told me to holler if I found anything wrong with her barn, in a tone that made it clear she expected me to find nothing. After that, I walked the property alone, because June had customers and because I wanted to see the barn Constance was so sure was dangerous. It took about 4 minutes of actually looking at it, instead of just glancing at it, to know something was off. The main support beam on the north wall had rot creeping up from a water intrusion point that should have been caught and sealed years earlier. A cheap fix if you catch it early, a few $100s, maybe less. Somebody hadn't caught it early. I'd seen this exact pattern before, on a job outside Joplin, a grain elevator whose owner had let a small leak sit for 2 winters because fixing it meant admitting